Absolute power always ends somehow. Some of history's most feared dictators died in gunfire, some in a jungle hut, one quietly in a hospital bed. 10 men who ruled through fear, and 10 very different final chapters. Here's how each one actually ended. It starts underground, in the last days of the Second World War. By late April 1945, Adolf Hitler wasn't commanding an empire anymore. He was hiding from one. Soviet tanks were rolling through Berlin, and the Führer who once ruled a continent was trapped in a concrete bunker under the Reich Chancellery, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyal officers. On April 29th, he married Eva Braun in a hurried midnight ceremony. The next afternoon, the two of them retreated into a private room. According to the people who found them minutes later, Hitler had bitten down on a cyanide capsule and fired a single shot into his own head. Eva took only the poison. Their bodies were carried up the stairs, soaked in gasoline, and burned in the garden while Soviet artillery pounded the city around them. He was 56. The man responsible for millions of deaths chose the one way out that guaranteed he'd never have to answer for any of them. And for decades afterward, people still argued about whether he really died there at all. Compare that to Nicolae Ceaușescu, who went from absolute ruler to a bullet-riddled wall in under 3 days. For more than 2 decades, he'd controlled Romania completely. Then, in December 1989, the country turned on him in hours. On December 22nd, as protesters flooded Bucharest, Ceausescu and his wife Elena tried to flee by helicopter. They were caught before the day was over. 3 days later, on Christmas morning, the two of them stood trial in a cramped room at a military base, on charges that included genocide and embezzlement of state funds. The whole thing lasted barely an hour. Elena kept insisting it was illegal. It didn't matter. Minutes after the verdict, they were led into a courtyard and shot by a firing squad, over 100 rounds between them. Cameras were rolling. By that evening, the footage was already playing on Romanian television, and the world watched a dictatorship end almost as fast as it had fallen apart. Joseph Stalin's ending is quieter, but just as brutal, because the fear he spent 30 years building may have delayed the help he received when he needed it most. On the night of March 1st, 1953, he hosted one of his usual late dinners outside Moscow, drinking heavily with officials who lived in constant terror of being purged. Around 4 in the morning, he sent everyone home and went to bed. Then, nothing. Hour after hour of silence from his room. Here's the part that says everything about the world Stalin built. His own guards were too afraid to check on him without being summoned. By the time someone worked up the nerve to look, they found him on the floor, partially paralyzed by a stroke, having lain there for nearly 12 hours. He lingered for days, unable to speak, before dying on March 5th. Some historians think the delay was simple fear. Others suspect something closer to relief, dressed up as loyalty. Either way, the public mourned. Privately, plenty of people were glad it was over. Fast forward to 2011, and Muammar Gaddafi, 42 years in power, ends up hiding in a drainage pipe. As Libya's civil war closed in, he fled his own capital and made a last stand in his hometown of Sirte. NATO airstrikes tore his convoy apart, and Gaddafi crawled into a concrete pipe with a few remaining bodyguards. When rebel fighters found him, they dragged him into the daylight, and by then, everyone had a phone. The footage is brutal, a bloodied, disoriented old man, begging to know what he'd done wrong, while fighters shouted and shoved him through the chaos. What exactly happened in those final minutes is still disputed, but he was shot, reportedly in the head, and died shortly after. His body ended up on public display in a commercial freezer in the city of Misrata, and he was eventually buried somewhere in the desert, the exact location never released. Benito Mussolini's end is almost a mirror of that. The man who once postured about rebuilding a Roman Empire spent his last hours disguised in a German soldier's coat, trying to sneak into Switzerland. Partisans stopped his convoy near Lake Como and found him hiding among the troops. He was executed the next day alongside his mistress, Clara Petacci, in a small village outside Milan. Then came the historic part. Their bodies were driven into the city and dumped in a square called Piazzale Loreto, the exact spot where Mussolini's own regime had displayed the bodies of 15 executed partisans just months earlier. A crowd gathered fast, and it turned ugly. People kicked the corpses, spat on them, fired into them again. One woman reportedly emptied 5 more rounds into his body, one for each son he'd cost her. Then the bodies were strung up by their feet from a gas station roof, while the crowd cheered underneath. It wasn't justice exactly. It was payback staged in the same place he'd once used to punish others. Then there's Kim Jong-il, who ruled North Korea for 17 years behind a personality cult so extreme that state propaganda reportedly claimed he could control the weather. In December 2011, the man built up as nearly superhuman died of something ordinary, a heart attack on a train, according to North Korean state media, who waited 2 days before announcing it. When the news finally broke, a news anchor appeared on state television dressed in black, weeping through the announcement, while footage showed citizens collapsing in the streets in grief. Real or performed, nobody outside North Korea could say. His body was embalmed and put on permanent display beside his father's. He never faced any consequences for the famine, the prison camps, or the executions carried out under his rule. Power simply passed to his son, and the whole system kept running exactly as designed. Rafael Trujillo's death flips the script entirely. For 31 years, he was the one ordering ambushes and disappearances, until, in May 1961, it happened to him instead. He was being driven along a highway outside Santo Domingo when several cars blocked the road. The men waiting for him were former military officers who'd once served under him, acting with the U.S. government's documented awareness, and by some accounts, quiet support. His car was riddled with bullets. Within minutes, he was dead on the roadside, his body stuffed into a car trunk, while his own killers argued over what to do next. The country descended into chaos afterward. Some conspirators were executed, others fled, but for a ruler who'd built his career on exactly this kind of violence, the ending fit. Saddam Hussein's execution was supposed to be controlled and dignified. It wasn't. After a lengthy trial for crimes against humanity, he was sentenced to hang, and at dawn on December 30th, 2006, he was led into an execution chamber at an Iraqi military base. Officials wanted it solemn. Someone in the room had a phone. As Saddam stood on the gallows, guards began taunting him with sectarian insults. He responded by reciting prayers, staying composed even as the floor dropped away beneath him. Within seconds it was over, but the grainy cell phone footage leaked almost immediately, and instead of a quiet, official death, the world got a viral video. His body was returned to his family and buried in his hometown. Some called it justice finally served. Others said the chaos of that footage disrespected even a man responsible for exactly the kind of state violence that killed him. Then there's Pol Pot, the man behind a genocide that killed up to 2 million people, who died in his sleep in a jungle hut in 1998. No trial, no verdict, nothing. After his regime collapsed in 1979, he spent almost 2 decades hiding near the Thai border, eventually placed under house arrest by his own former movement. He died on April 15th, reportedly of heart failure, at 73. The timing raised eyebrows. It came just days after his old allies had agreed to hand him over for an international war crimes trial. Knowing how skeptical the world would be, his captors put his body on display for journalists to photograph, just to prove he was actually dead. There was no trial, no accountability. He was cremated on a makeshift pyre of tires and trash, a strangely small ending for a man responsible for something so vast. And finally, Augusto Pinochet, the one who got away with it. He seized power in Chile in a bloody 1973 coup, and over 17 years, thousands of people were tortured, killed, or simply disappeared under his rule. Unlike almost everyone else on this list, Pinochet didn't die violently, or in hiding, or on camera. In December 2006, after a week of declining health following a heart attack, he died peacefully in a hospital bed, surrounded by family, at 91, on International Human Rights Day, of all dates. He'd spent his final years dodging exactly the kind of justice this list is full of. Arrested in London in 1998 on international warrants, released on medical grounds, sent home to face charges his lawyers stalled for years by arguing he was too sick to stand trial. He never spent a single day in prison. Some Chileans celebrated in the streets. Others mourned a man they credited with saving the country from communism. No firing squad, no mob, no verdict, just a quiet death. And that, in its own way, might be the most unsettling ending of all. 10 men, 10 different endings, bunkers, firing squads, drainage pipes, jungle huts, hospital beds. Some faced mobs, some faced cameras, some faced absolutely nothing at all. And that's really the point. Power doesn't guarantee a reckoning. Sometimes it ends in gunfire. Sometimes it just ends, quietly, with nobody ever really made to answer for it.